Well, hello everyone. If you don't know by now, my name is Eli Travers, I'm the estate manager now over at our Red Mountain Tasting Room and Estate Vineyard here in Benton City. I've been with Avennia for the last 5 years or so. Before this, I was over in Seattle, and I was basically selling our wines in King County, all throughout the Seattle area, in stores and restaurants. And that's how I got to know the business pretty well. I also was the harvest intern in 2017. So that was how I first got to meet Chris and the whole team here and get to know the wines. But even before that, I was working in restaurants in Seattle at Purple Cafe and Wine Bar and the Heavy Restaurant Group, where I was literally selling Avennia wines since their first vintage, so it's been really fun to sort of see this whole progression and now be in a new place with a new vineyard and have this whole new adventure for Avennia, which is super exciting. So we put this together basically as a way to reach out to people more and find a way to, I guess, dig a little deeper and geek out a bit about some of the details on vineyards and on viticulture. This is really exciting for me because I am by no means an expert in this topic. I have been literally pouring through books and writing notes frantically for the last week, trying to get some more information that I could pass on to you all. But inevitably, there's going to be some questions you might have or some things that you're going to want to ask later on our field trip. And so I encourage you to if you want to take any notes about questions you'll have, feel free. This is not a homework or a test style course. So the only thing you're not required to do but encouraged is to have some wine available. It definitely helps loosen up your receptors and take in some new information. So that's what we're doing. I'm drinking a little Sauvignon Blanc, our Olean here to celebrate.
Cheers.
Cheers, everyone. Yes, of course. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see the screen right now? Back to school, Avennia Estate Vineyard, with this glorious picture I took a little while ago of the sun. Well, the sun sets in the other direction, but sometimes it has a really beautiful shadow. So following the 4 seasons of our estate vineyard on Red Mountain. So this is what to expect over this next month. I put this in the email as well, so this should look pretty familiar. But today we're going to spend some time talking about the winter season, sort of what happens in the vineyard over winter, both that dormancy period, but also into pruning and all the things surrounding preparing the vineyard to start growing in the spring. And so then next week we'll talk about spring and then summer and then the fun harvest season, which we are in now. And it is, let me tell you, crazy, but in the best way possible. And then in addition to all the viticultural stuff, we are in the process, we've planted a new vineyard here at the estate, and we've replanted a vineyard that was formerly Merlot and now is Cabernet. So we'll talk a little bit also about that whole process, what it's like to start a new vineyard if you do want to plant a vineyard from scratch, and sort of how that's done through that first year, through that first leaf, as it were. So winter, put this. So dormancy and pruning. So if we look at the vine growing calendar, this is sort of a generic Northern Hemisphere version of what happens. So you can see here through December, January, February, and March, this is what we're talking about today. There's not much, obviously there's no green growth, nothing really happening growing wise, but there's still a lot happening underneath, inside the vine, under the ground, and of course, with a lot of the labor and things you have to put into preparing sites and maintaining sites. And then we'll work our way through this whole cycle as we work through the class. So thinking about what are vines doing as they approach dormancy, as they've already been harvested, the leaves are still there, but they're preparing that long trek into winter. And what's really interesting is that the vine is really sensing that it's going to be time to shut down way before we think they are. That already when the summer solstice happens in June and through July, the vine already starts to sense there's receptors in the leaves, photoreceptors that sense that the days are going to get shorter. And so cold acclimation, the whole process of how a vine will start adjusting to cooler weather actually starts much earlier in the summer. Even when it's still hot, there's already signals happening inside the vine that says we need to start preparing ourselves for dormancy. So cold acclimation really gears up during veraison, which we'll talk about again in a couple of weeks. But that ripening, this is the period when the grapes are ripening from hard green berries into purple or yellow berries. That's happening concurrently with the vine sending signals and preparing for winter. And then after grapes are harvested, the leaves will still stay on for a while and continue to photosynthesize. And what that's doing, it's producing carbohydrates and then sending them down into the woody parts of the vine to store it so it has energy over winter. So that sends it into the cordons, that permanent sort of arm along the trellis, into the trunks, and into the roots. And this is also a time they call root flush. So when that's happening and it's sending some extra carbohydrates into the root system, there's a whole bunch of new small roots that begin to grow and seeking extra nutrients in the soil. So it has as many possibilities to get water and nutrients as it needs it to last through the winter. And then after the leaves drop, so a little later in this time, it loses those photoreceptors, it loses the ability to photosynthesize. That's when the vine becomes a little more sensitive to temperature drops as it does start to get colder and colder. But this also starts that second phase of cold hardiness, or getting basically towards full dormancy. So what's happening? This is a really interesting time in the vine. You can think of dormancy, this whole period during the winter, in sort of two different phases. So the first phase is endodormancy, endo being inside. And this is some of the stuff that's happening inside the vine in this portion of the season. One of the main things that starts this process is called abscisic acid. And it's basically a hormone, a plant growth regulator that builds up in the vine, and it regulates that metabolic process. So it starts shutting the vine down for winter. It's really interesting. There's actually producers in colder parts of the country. So think Ohio, Michigan, sort of some lake effect regions in the Midwest that are still growing vinifera vines. They're actually experimenting now using abscisic acid to jumpstart dormancy, where they'll, in really cold winters, or if they know they have a lot of cold coming on, that they can spray and basically use abscisic acid to to convince the plant that it's time to shut down, to protect it before it gets too cold. And that's stuff that's happening over the last couple of years. So it's still being researched and figured out, but it's a pretty interesting process. So when this happens, this basically is inhibiting all growth. So this is shutting the vine down so that it can withstand cold temperatures, that it's not going to grow at all, even if it starts warming up. So if favorable temperatures return, if you have that mid-winter's warming, what that happens, as long as it's still in this endodormancy phase, the vine is shut down completely. The other thing that happens is that the water level inside all the tissues in the vine decreases. And the vine basically binds the water to sugars and different protein complexes that are called cryoprotectorants. And this basically protects cells from getting damaged, because if it does freeze and those ice crystals expand, that can harm vines and harden vine material. And this process helps it so that it won't expand. The ice crystals basically won't form and damage the vine. And so this is the process that makes it completely cold hardy. And you basically need, there's some research saying 150, some saying 200, but what they're calling chilling hours that are needed in this phase in order to the vine to achieve the right balance and the right shutdown in order to bud break in the spring. And chilling hours are basically just how many hours are spent above freezing, so above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's below freezing in this time, it's actually not really affecting the vine that much, to a point, which we'll talk about in a second. But you need a pretty good time of chilling hours. Now, to be fair, we're in a place that experiences a good long winter, or long enough that this isn't really as much of an issue. But in warmer parts of the world that are growing grapevines, sometimes it is hard to even get that 150 to 200 hours of chilling time to really have the vine sleep in dormancy. And so that can be an issue. And if it doesn't achieve that minimum in those really warm spaces, then it could delay bud break. You could have this prolonged dormancy, and it really throws the vine out of whack. But once you do get that minimum time, and the the plant and the temperatures start rising again. As long as it's gone through that endodormancy phase, it begins its second phase called ecodormancy or ecodormancy. I'm actually not sure the actual pronunciation of that. But this is basically saying the plant's now ready for bud break if it happens, if it starts warming up to the right environmental conditions. But usually after 150 hours in the winter, especially here, we're not going to get those environmental conditions for months, right? Until March, even though it's already been in this endodormancy phase through December. So it's interesting because this is when it gets kind of nerve-wracking. And this is when, especially with a warming climate and a lot of fluctuations in seasonal temperatures, once the vine reaches ecodormancy, we really don't want it to get warm and then cold again. Because if it gets warmer, the vine now is sending signals to start bud break and start its growing season. And it really can't go backwards. It will not be able to adjust to cold temperatures again. And so that is kind of a risky point. Whereas if the vine's completely shut down in endodormancy, cold temperatures won't necessarily harm it. The only time it does is when you have very extreme freezing temperatures and extreme freezes. So even in that endodormancy phase, you can get extreme freezes that will cause cracks in the trunk or in the cordon, and that will allow certain diseases or certain fungi or bacteria to penetrate the vine, and then we can have some issues. But this also changes based on what variety it is. So I sort of put here, these are the three main grapes we have at our estate vineyard. And so depending on the variety, they're actually cold hardy at different levels. So Cabernet Franc, for instance, can withstand much cooler weather than Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot. And you kind of think of it, at least when I think of that, I think of France and Cabernet Franc that grows in the Loire Valley. It's a more northern location. One of the reasons is because it can actually stand cooler winters, whereas Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot down in Bordeaux are need a little warmer climate. And I know that France is it's not super extreme between those two regions, but for me, it kind of helps delineate those three. Merlot is definitely the riskiest. It can't really take super cold temperatures. And I didn't put it here, but when you think of things like Riesling also can go down to like -10 before you have to worry about deep freezes penetrating and causing issues. Certain hybrid varieties like Vidal Blanc or Marquette and some of these other varieties that were developed for cold hardiness, a lot of them from Minnesota or other parts where they're using them in cooler climates, those can see -20 degrees, -15, -25. And even Concord grapes. So our table grapes, there's a lot of table grape farmers and growers in the valley, and those can go down to -25 degrees as well. So that's with cold freezes. Snowfall is a little less risky. Obviously, it can feel more dramatic because when you have snow events, it seems like everything's going to be cold, but it actually helps to insulate the vines and prevents it from getting too cold. Like snow is happening at 36 degrees or 30 to 32 or below, obviously, but rarely do you get a lot of snow and it be under 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And so snowfall actually really helps protect the vines from getting down to that critical level. Although it can be troublesome around bud break. We'll actually talk about this next week because this picture on the right that you see was taken in the middle of April here. This was a really interesting spring on Red Mountain where we actually had some snow 3 times in 1 week in the middle of April. So that was a very interesting tax season. But luckily we weren't really affected, again, because these were our main grapes and they hadn't reached bud break yet. It's the grapes that had started to open up and buds were bursting and then got snow, that can be troublesome. Unfortunately, the cherry orchards had a really hard time with it because they were blooming much earlier than grapes. But we were lucked out. But again, we'll talk about it more. But what are some ways that we can mitigate and protect our vines from having to deal with some of these issues? There's a few things you can do. It's the last thing, but one of the biggest things is just your original vineyard design or site, your site selection. There's a lot of ways that you can plan a vineyard if you are planting a vineyard for the first time and make sure that you're not, in low-lying valleys or places where cold air will settle and drop down, so that you want to be higher up on a hill, say. You could be There's a lot of things about the type of soil and how soils will retain cold or temperature. But other than if you're stuck with the vineyard you have, which again, we are here on this beautiful property and these are what the vines are. So what are the other ways that we can mitigate? Hilling is another way. So in France, they call it butage. And it's the process of actually burying the base of the trunks in dirt. So a lot of times it'll be done through a tractor pass. The tractor will go through with certain blades on the side, and it'll slowly build these mounds or hills on the trunks of the vine. It's really critical, especially in young vines, to cover up the grafting point. This is where the young vines are grafted onto rootstock, and that's a really sensitive area. So putting dirt around it will help it protect it and insulate it from any cold temperatures. Another thing you'll see that's pretty common are frost protection fans, or these wind turbines. They're basically windmills. You'll see them dotted throughout Red Mountain as well, a little further down the hill where cold air does tend to fall. And what it does is you can turn them on. They're usually powered by gas or electricity, and they're meant to circulate the air from where the canopy is up to 40, 50 feet above the vines. And there could be even a 2 to 4 degree temperature swing there. So if it's it doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually can be really useful, because in a matter of degrees is critical when you're looking at really cold temperatures. So those will be turned on sometimes, and it'll just circulate that warmer air on top with the cooler air. Another thing that's done often is sprinkling water. So turning sprinklers on, and that will form this ice barrier around the vine, which again sounds extreme, but it actually again insulates the vine and protects it from those colder temperatures. Because ice can form around 32 degrees, but the vine won't get to 0 degrees or -10 degrees with ice around it. The other way, so this was an interesting point, is when you design your vineyard or when you're training your initial vines. This is a picture of 2 different Syrah vines on the property. And you can see the one on the left has 1 trunk that eventually splits up into 2 cordons. And the one on the right has 2 trunks. Most commonly, you'll see 2 trunks. If you walk through our vineyard, or when you do walk through our vineyard, you'll see most of the vines along rows are actually have 2 trunks coming up, and then they're trained out to the side into cordons. And that's also by design to help protect from freezing temperatures. Because most often when you do have a freeze event and there's an issue with bacteria, or if something cracks, most of the time only one of those 2 trunks is affected, and you can lop it off and still keep that other trunk and eventually train a new cane into a permanent cordon. So it's a way to save that vine, that space. Whereas if you only have 1 trunk like on the left, and if it gets infected, then you've lost that spacing, that whole vine area, and you're losing quite a bit of fruit. So I just thought that was pretty interesting. So then that's getting us through some cold times in December and into January. But this is also the time when we're starting to think about pruning. This is the other big part of this season of winter and what's being done. So the first thing that's usually done with pruning is actually pre-pruning, which sounds pretty obvious, but it's a pretty critical part of the process. And so the main point of pre-pruning is just prepping the vineyard for the hand pruning that'll happen afterwards. There are machines you can get that will do mechanical pruning, where you will run a tractor through the vineyard. And that totally makes sense with certain business models and certain vineyards that need quicker labor. But for us, we do want to take a lot of care and take our time with it. So we're not using tractors for the final prune, but it's really great to use them for this first pass. And what this does, you can see in this picture that there's, 5 to 6 buds on here, or nodes on these canes. It's basically a way to get rid of all the mess that's going to be above the trellising system that would just be so hard to get through when you're going into prune, to prepare a better space for workers to go through. Usually it'll shorten them to about 1 foot, like 12 inches. They'll have 6 to 8 inner One of the benefits is, it makes the canopy easier, but it also removes any disease potential. When any sort of bacteria or virus or fungi that gets into the vine, a lot of times it'll enter through the very end of the cane. And so if you're able to clip off those ends, then you're removing any of that disease possibility. You will then sort of need to collect those canes and dispose of them somehow, which we'll talk about in a second. Or you can walk through, and if everything looks fine, a lot of times they can just be left there. But it is a way to cut back for disease risk. And then the other thing with any tractor pass in a vineyard, you're always risking any infrastructure mistakes. So sometimes you'll just get cut wires, or if a post gets knocked, and that's just sort of the cost of doing business. So a lot of times there'll be certain things you'll have to go back through and make sure your vineyard is structurally sound after the fact. And so, so what we did, this is our block. This is our original block of Cabernet. Those vines were planted in 1985. They went through, did a pass of pre-pruning, and then they did a second tractor pass to level the ground. And so what this was, in that hilling process where the tractor goes through and the blades push dirt onto the bottoms of the trunks, they can do another pass which basically reverses it. And so it brings the dirt back down and levels that ground, which is going to make it much easier for our workers to go through and do their final prune. So this hand pruning is done usually in February and March. So it's still cold, but it's sort of better to do it closer to spring than earlier in the winter. At least that's how we're approaching it. There's lots of decisions that are being made now too about how you're pruning, what you're pruning, and what it's meant to do. And what you're doing is basically deciding how much fruit are you getting this season. All of that is happening, or a lot of that decision is happening while you're pruning. It's most common that you're pruning each cane down to only 2 buds. You're leaving 2 buds on each little spur is what they're called. And those 2 buds eventually will form 2 new canes, or 2 shoots in the spring. And each of those shoots will have 2 clusters on them that will harvest. And so after pruning, you can already have a rough estimate of how much yield you're going to get in that vineyard. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of factors like vintage and weather that can mess that up, or green harvesting and certain things. But in general, you have an idea of how much fruit you want when you're going through to prune. You're also deciding about what sort of canopy shape do you want. So when you go through and prune all these canes, which are last year's shoots that had grape clusters on them, you're going to have an opportunity to select either a cane that looks really strong and great and is pointing in the right direction, or something that looks kind of weak and is pointing off to the side. And you get to decide, okay, I'm going to clip this one and keep this one because this one seems like it's growing in the right direction. This is really important for us, especially because when we got here in our vineyard, there was a lot of lateral growth. And you can see, well, I'll point it out when you're here. A lot of the cordons are trained, obviously they go up, they're trained on the trellis. And then from there, a lot of the spurs are trained horizontally. They go out instead of up. And that's one of the things Dick Boucher, our vineyard manager, is looking to do over time, is slowly prune so that they're facing up again. Because we can get a lot more, we can get better quality fruit. It's easier to shade. It's easier to work the vineyards without this lateral growth. And so that's one of the things they're doing during pruning that makes it a very exact process. A lot of the previous year's growth is removed, like I said, 70 to 90%. But the reason that we want this to be really deliberate is, for all the reasons I just said, is why we also pay our workers the most to do this. This is one of the most expensive passes of the whole year. A lot of times you'll end up paying your vineyard workers by the hour for this type of job instead of by the vine or by the row. And it's to incentivize to slow down and make really calculated decisions on what you're cutting, where you're cutting, and really take a look at the vine. It was really great. And I got to watch them prune. Well, in a minute, I'll show you the picture of Consuela, who was a master at pruning. But yeah, it's a super important part of the year. And then just a little sidebar on training and pruning. And this is another topic that we could talk for a whole hour on just pruning and training. I don't think that's the most beneficial for us today, but in general, there's only a few different options when you're looking at pruning. This is the difference between cane pruning and spur pruning. You can see cane pruning, the way I think of it is cane pruning, you leave a cane, and in spur pruning, you leave spurs. So you're cutting off most of the growth. And in cane pruning, you want to leave that one long cane, at least one in a single guillot. This is a double guillot style training where you have 2 canes. And that a lot of times that's done in more northern climates. So it's very common in Pinot Noir and Burgundy, and in places where you do have to worry a little bit more about colder winters. And part of that's because you can see here, this whole trunk, this is called head training, because you're training a trunk to have this one head and then a couple canes out from it, as opposed to cordon training, which is when you have those thicker arms. But having this be the woodiest, most protected part of the vine actually makes it less susceptible to winter damage. So when you only have a couple canes here, and those pruning, those pruning wounds, there's only a couple of them, then you have less risk. Whereas with spurs, you have all these pruning wounds or pruning sites that could be infected. And so this is more common in warmer areas and warmer climates, like Red Mountain. Although I've seen this cane pruning down the hill on some vineyard. I don't know what it is, but I'm gonna find out. And then these are just some other types of training systems. You can see these first two, the single cordon and the double cordon. Again, that's cordon training, where you want that permanent arm, and then each year you'll have different shoots and different spurs and growth, versus your head training, which is this, like this single and double guillot, or this goblet head trained down here on the bottom. Basically, you're just training the vine up, it forms a head, and then you either have a cane or spur on top. Things get really crazy when you get into Geneva double curtain and lyre and all these other ways of training vines. And there's different reasons for doing them based on where you are. This basket weave training is a system they do in Greece on the island of Santorini. So it's so windy there that they have to protect the vines by basically training it into a basket, and then the fruit hangs inside the basket. It's a really, really cool training technique. We won't be doing that here. And then this is Consuela going through and pruning. And you can see how there was dirt, this whole area along the row that was first mounded into it and then brought out so it was a little more even so you could work through it. And on the right here, this is what it looks like after the fact. So these are all spurs that have just a few nodes on each spur. And you can kind of see here, see this area right here, that's that lateral growth that we're going to try to fix. So that's one of the reasons why we're trying to go up, but also trying to keep spurs that are closer to the center of the cordon as opposed to these. This one probably got out of hand. That one might be pruned back this year. So then what do we do with the cuttings? Because obviously we go through, there's all this vine material, woody, stocky vine material on the ground. One of the more traditional ways, and they still do this in Burgundy and other parts of the world, is to burn them, is to collect them. A lot of times they'll just bring right down the row. We've actually, when Shelly and I were in Burgundy, we watched them do this, and they have this little fire pit on wheels, and they just throw canes and they burn and walk through. It's pretty labor intensive. It also pollutes the air. It's not necessarily the most beneficial thing you can do, but it is beneficial to get rid of diseased vines. So if you do have canes that had some disease pressure or any pest, it's great to be able to get rid of them. The other thing you can do is collect them all. If you are worried about pest or disease, you can collect them all out of the vineyard and then burn them on the side. That's also more commonly done. Or take them out, mulch them, and then get rid of them somewhere else. It's much more common to just mulch them right in the vineyard and spread them out and have them start to decompose and return that nutrients to the soil. Again, this is an extra pass that you'll take with a flail mower that can chop up all those canes. Honestly, the easiest way, which we've done with a couple of the blocks, is just leave the canes on the ground. They will eventually break down, and you don't really need to worry about them. Or you do what Shelly and I did, and you pick a couple of really good ones and then make s'mores, and they're really good s'mores sticks. So we'll have some of those when you guys are out as well. And then what's sort of the first sign? So after you've pruned and you're kind of waiting for things to wake up, when do things wake up? And this is what we call weeping or bleeding. And it's one of those signs of the end of winter. So as the temperature starts warming up, so now we're in February and March, after pruning, the vine will start to bleed or weep this clear sap. This is happening because the soil temperature has now gotten up to between 45 and 48 degrees Fahrenheit. And those reactivated roots that are now searching for more water and for more nutrients are causing this positive pressure. So it's forcing all this sap and this water up through the plant and out of those pruning sites. It's not just water, it has plant hormones, there's some sugars, amino acids, and other things. And you might not be thinking it, but my first thought as a Vermonter was, can you make this sap and boil it into a syrup? because I just think that'd be fascinating, because maple sap is delicious and syrup's great, but I think you'd have to have a lot of sap and collect it in order to justify it. And we'll see how much I can get next year, but I might try a little experiment. But it could be terrible. But this is, it's a very normal, natural thing. The first time I saw it, I got worried when I was here. We moved here in March, saw some pruning, and all of a sudden, wines are just dripping, and you're like, oh no, this is bad, something's happening. And of course, it's completely normal. It's part of the renewals, part of the plant. And it's very important. And then, and then when the average temperature in the air reaches 50 degrees, the average daily temperature, this is when the vine will finally emerge from dormancy and prepare itself for that next step. So this is the second part. I'll try to speed through this because I know it's already 6:12. I know we got a little late start, but we are in the process of replanting a vineyard on property and planting a new vineyard. We'll talk about block 4 first, which is our replanted vineyard. So when you come up Sunset, the first vineyard you see sort of on the right at the end of the road is this block 4. We made the decision to take out the Merlot that was there. There were some issues with the Merlot. Again, older vines are gonna get leaf roll virus, which is very, very common, which will eventually degrade the vineyard and just make really, really low yields. You just don't get as much fruit. And so it becomes economically, not viable to keep it going. So that was one of the reasons. Another reason was just the spacing was very wide. The vines were actually planted 10 feet apart. So each row was 10 feet apart, and each vine was about 6 feet apart from each other. And we wanted to condense it into a 4x7 spacing. So 4 feet between each plant, 7 feet between each row. You can fit a whole lot more vines in the same area, in that same acreage, by doing that. And then we had to decide what we wanted to plant. We decided on Cabernet Sauvignon. We thought the soil type was a little bit better for that variety. The place, also a lot of times, it comes down to marketing decisions. Cabernet Sauvignon sells for a little bit more money than Merlot or Cabernet Franc or Mourvèdre or any of these other varieties you might plant. And luckily, Red Mountain is just known for growing incredible Cabernet Sauvignon. So we thought it made a lot of sense to plant Cabernet. And we have 2 different clones up there, clone 33 and 47. We can get into clones more in the following weeks because that's a whole other topic. But we are trying out 2 different clones in this vineyard. And then the other cool thing that you'll see when you're here is that we've changed the row orientation. So a lot of the vines here on Red Mountain are north-south. So all the rows are just directly north and south. And over the last dozen or so years, maybe 20 years, there's been a lot more research into the optimal angle of vineyard rows for ripening and for sun exposure and light exposure. And based on where we are, we're around the 46th parallel in the Northern Hemisphere. If you're actually about 15 degrees, 12 to 15 degrees off of north, you actually get a much more optimal light shining into your vineyard throughout the growing season. And so a lot of new vineyards are deciding to do that sort of 15 degree or the slightly off kilter rows. And so what do we need to do in order to do this? Obviously, you have to remove all the old vine material and any vineyard infrastructure, post trellising, any irrigation, all the piping. That's the first step. Then you have to test the soil for all the physical properties, like how much water holding capacity does the soil have, how much clay is in the soil, how much just loamy clay or silt or wind-blown loess, and all these properties to match the best rootstock and the best clones. And then also chemical properties, how much salts and free lye and all these things, or free lime, are in the soil. And then you also want to treat the area for any pests or any potential pests. So these are some pictures of when we were pulling out the Merlot. So we'd go through with this basically attachment here, yanks the roots up, really crazy root systems. I mean, it's so amazing to see vines' root systems and how extensive they go. But you can also see here how wide these spaces were. I mean, if this is a tractor, well, it's not a tractor of the Bobcat, but still the tractor is not much wider than that. And so there's all this extra space in between that you don't necessarily need, which is one of the reasons why we condensed the vines. So yeah, ripped them all out. And then this is sort of a more distant picture, but then you can see that was all just leveled out, all sandy. They removed all the posts, everything else. I actually still have some of the old vines that were burning in our fireplace. They make a really good tinder. So, and so, yeah, basically at this point, you're leveling it, you're removing any other debris. You want to treat the soil, so just in case there's any nematodes, which are little tiny microscopic worms, or any pests, phylloxera. We've lucked out that phylloxera hasn't been a big deal in Washington for the most part. But it's a way just to make sure you're starting fresh, starting new. You're also measuring out and planning out where your rows are, marking rows with tractors, and then planning irrigation lines and infrastructure. All that stuff is something we'll look at next week with the new block. So before next week, basically we're at this point where what happens after the weeping? You know, we're arriving, spring, it's getting warmer. When did we finally get above 50 degrees? That was interesting. And then when did the new vines go in the ground? What does that look like? How does that process happen? And then we'll talk about our other new block, which is very exciting across the street. So all these will be answered next week. And that is basically the first week of class. So that wasn't too bad, right? It wasn't too much information, maybe. We'll see.
Can we get copies of that?
Oh yeah, this of the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I can make that happen.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
Great job.
Well, thank
Very
you.
Interesting.
So at this point, we have a few minutes. If you have any questions that popped up that you want to ask, we can have a little discussion time. And then I do want to leave a few minutes for Shelly here to just maybe say a note, say hello, and ask me any other questions. But do any of you have any questions right off the bat about winter, about dormancy or pruning?
I have a really simple one.
Yeah.
Can I ask one? So
Yeah.
the only familiar part of my life that connects with pruning is with roses and pruning. Like you have they make such a big deal about having a nice clean cut. And when you talk about a tractor coming through and like whacking the tops of all these things off, I just wonder about all these open, but is that because the real cuts happen later, or is it because it's like a strong thing that doesn't need such sensitive care?
No, it's a great question. And it definitely is, you definitely want the cleaner cuts eventually. And so that's why that first pass with the tractor is more just to it's like a little bit off the top, it's like you get a haircut and you just get the little bit of mess, and then you're going to go in and get a little more detailed. And because, you're
going to go lower. You're going to cut lower. It's just to get the mess out of the way.
It's to get that original mess. And again, a lot of times is disease pressure too, getting the very tips of the canes out of the way, so you don't have to worry about disease. And then it kind of prolongs the amount of time you have until you need to prune, to do that final pruning pass. But yeah, the final pruning pass, like roses, has to be very, very careful, very specific cuts.
Yeah.
So, and that was all done by hand. The vineyard crew came out.
Right.
And
those
it's
pictures
all out here anyway on our vineyard. It's mostly women, and this group of women came, and it's very precise, but they're very fast. It was fascinating to watch them, how quickly they could move down the rows with their clippers, and in a matter of hours have gone through a whole planting.
It's really funny as far as speed in vineyard workers, because now we have videos of pruning, we have them doing suckering, green harvesting, and now harvesting. And pruning was fast, but wait till you see them sucker and harvest. It is like lightning speed. It's incredible how fast they work. So, which is great though. Our vineyard team, so Dick Boucher's workers are, he manages a bunch of vineyards on Red Mountain. So they're very, very busy, because we're not the only vineyard they're working on, even just locally. So speed is key.
So is that his crew that comes in and prunes those vines for everyone?
It's his crew? Yeah, it's his crew.
Okay, so it's his kind of thing.
Yeah, and he's had some of these women, and some of his workers have been with him for 20 years. So they've worked with him, they know his style. They've got great leads in the field. I mean, it's a really solid team. Yeah. That's
really cool. So I have a question. Yeah. And I don't know if this is the right place to ask it. Botrytized wines. I was thinking about the whole, the endodormancy, ectodormancy, but what happens in the case of when you want to make botrytized wine? Yeah,
so like with that, the noble rot is what you're talking about, right?
Right.
Yeah, so that's it's a good question. That'll still happen before dormancy. So usually the botrytis will start infecting grape clusters after veraison, after the ripening, and you'll get towards like now, so September, October in the Northern Hemisphere, when you start seeing botrytis, if you're after that noble rot, the botrytized dessert style wines, they'll start doing passes through the vineyard to start picking clusters that have it. But that still all will be happening before the leaves fall, before it starts descending all the way into dormancy. One thing I don't know, and I'll find out, is does that affect the woody parts of the vine at all? Because I don't know, and I'm pretty sure the mold is more of just a cluster effect. It's only affecting berries. It's not necessarily going to affect anything.
Okay, so maybe a better question would be relative to ice wines.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah, ice wines are fascinating too, and it's funny because I didn't brush up on it here, but I've studied it before, because ice wines, depending on where you are in Germany and Canada, they have different laws about how cold it has to be for you to pick them. And I want to say it's like -5 degrees Celsius in Germany, maybe -7 or -6 degrees in Canada. So this is when you're basically leaving grapes on the vine. You don't harvest them, you leave them on the vine all the way through until November. And I think it also dictates you can't pick before a certain time in November. But the berries will basically freeze, and then you pick them while they're frozen, and you have very specific presses that can handle the load of pressing, like icy grapes. But it's great because it concentrates the sugars and the flavor. I mean, they can be really intriguing wines, but it's interesting because I'm not sure how that affects the process of, sending carbohydrates into the vine from the leaves, because there's still grapes on the vine. So I'll look into that.
It's kind of an interesting, it just it's got to be some different how that works, but
no, that's great. And I love ice wine.
And then I would imagine a certain part of the vineyard then would have to be, you hope to designate it for ice wines and not harvest. And I understand it's probably a whole different process. So
well, it's also really hard to do, I think, here in Red Mountain, just because I mean, this is the first season I've lived here, but I imagine it still doesn't get too cold in November, that it might not get cold enough to make ice wine type wines until December or January. And by that time,
maybe not with Red Mountain fruit.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But I wonder, I mean, maybe in, like northern Puget Sound or Chelan. I mean, remember, there might be other parts in the state. I know in Canada they're doing it. They're for sure doing it. But I'll look into that. That's really interesting. That's cool. Were there any other questions about winter dormancy or anything?
I have one more question. I'm sorry. So the lateral growth, is there any reason that they would have selected that purposefully to train the vine that way? Is there some reason to do it that way, or?
It must have been, because it was very common 30 years ago when vines were being planted. And I'll ask Larry, our former owner, about it. But even Dick, when I asked him, he said, yeah, it was really common. They sort of believed that, and I don't know whether it was a canopy decision, whether it was because they wanted to shape the canopy in a way to help shade the clusters with more lateral growth, or if it was, I don't think it could be yield related. If anything, it puts more stuff in the way when you're trying to go through with a tractor or anything like that. So yeah.
And that's the only thing I can figure with canopies is that, I mean, I'm sure it affects obviously how much sun the grapes are getting, maybe humidity levels to some extent.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that happen, and we'll talk about this in spring and summer, where how the canopy, it has its own microclimate. Yeah, it has lower temperature. There's transpiration in the vine that cools things off even when it's really hot. So there's a lot of things that the canopy can change throughout the year.
Cool.
So yeah, but I'll ask Larry. That's great. Well, thanks so much. We're at 6:25, so I know that some of you might need to go as well. Shelly, I don't know if you wanted to just say a quick word or just remind people to get back to us about field trip.
Yeah, I'll just say hello for those of you. I think I've met everyone here. So it's good to see all of your beautiful faces, and welcome back to school. So you'll get emails from me. I sent one out last week asking if you all have any dietary restrictions. We're very excited to plan our dinner with Chef Aislinn. So if you do have any dietary restrictions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, you know, we'll feel like everything is on the table. Also, if you have any questions about getting here or anything that you need to help getting organized for your weekend out here, you can send me an email, and either Eli or I will continue to send you a reminder email each week just about class and make sure that you have everything you need. That's all I needed to say.
Great. Oh, Denise, I think you're muted. I don't know. What was that you said, Denise?
Okay, can I ask an off-topic question?
Sure.
How did Tuesday go with your grapes?
It was great. We picked, so Shelly and I and 2 of our tasting room employees and some friends, actually Chef Aislinn and her friend came over, and we picked 0.87 tons of Syrah. There's a little block of Syrah in our vineyard. It took us about 2.5 hours. We picked it right into a bin in the vineyard and foot stomped quite a bit of it. Shelly had the first job getting in there.
That's really so cold. Fun.
It was so fun. I didn't know that foot stomping was still like a common practice. I thought it was only like in I Love Lucy. And
I'll volunteer. Hedges does that with their LeBlanc. They have a grape that they foot stomp pretty. That's kind of the tradition. I've done that. It was really fun, and that's exactly what I came to mind. I Love Lucy.
Yeah, totally.
No fights though. Nobody threw grapes at each other though.
Right.
It's a big bin. It was a little bit hard to get in and out of it, honestly. But we had a good time, and then Eli and I, let's see, so now it's the bin is in the winery, and we added yeast and sulfur, and it's just, you know,
we'll see what happens. It's very possible, and when you guys come here on November 5th, that it'll be going through ML or malolactic fermentation. Oh, cool. We might be able to taste something. It could be kind of fun. But
great, that'd be awesome.
How much do you think that you did? How many bottles? Probably.
I'm pretty sure. So we're going to be able to press it over the high towers. Tim Hightower was kind enough to let us do that. So I think we'll get a little over 2 barrels worth, which honestly could be, you know, 50 cases of wine. Syrah.
Whoa!
So
amazing.
You all will get some Syrah, I promise.
Yay!
So. Well, anyway, thank you all so much for coming. Again, if you can't make the next classes, I hope you'll be here, but if not, I'll make sure that the recording is made, and I'll send that recording out to you, or I'll find a way for you to get it. It'll probably be a link on YouTube. That'll be a private link, so you can watch it after the fact. And then just keep an eye on emails. I'll see you a week from now, and we'll talk about spring, and things will get really nice and flowery and bright. So thank you all.
Very good.
Thank you
so much. Thank you.
It was fun.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.